This is Kasterborous. James McLean and myself, Christian Colley, are here to discuss a topic that we pre-select through a very vague late-night WhatsApp chat occasionally. This week, however, our attention has been drawn to news of the passing of Christopher H Bidmead, the former script editor of Doctor Who, way back 45 years ago. His run of Doctor Who kicked off a couple of weeks ago, 45 years ago. Tomorrow, as we record this on Friday the 5th, tomorrow would be the airing of the second episode of The Leisure Hive. Due to the nature of the discussion of this week's podcast, we're bringing the entire episode to you, both on Patreon and on Spotify. That means you'll get it earlier on Patreon and ad-free on Patreon, but on Spotify, you will get the same episode. There's no additional material for this podcast, although if you do use our Patreon, you do get additional material drops, not just associated with the podcast, but with other stuff from the Kasterborous archive. He's quite an interesting figure in Doctor Who, wasn't he? Although he only had one season, he had quite an impact. I think it left a bit of a shadow. There are various views on his contributions to the show, aren't there? But you're a fan, aren't you? Because you and I are of a similar age, and I think that season is where it sort of Doctor Who sort of comes alive in your head slightly, doesn't it?
For me, it does, yeah. I think we've said before, Leisure Hive is my earliest memory as a kid. Logopolis is still possibly my favourite, perhaps one of my favourite stories of Doctor Who ever. So, Bidmead's contribution, I really enjoyed it. And as an adult, I enjoy more, I think, than I did as a kid.
Right. Is that because the science... Is that a science thing, or is it like a script writing thing? Is it what is that? What is that?
I think it's a science thing. I think it's a science thing embedded in a show which is already unusual in its format, making it even more unusual in its format. So, you have these, as we know, very odd, or not odd, but sort of slightly tangential to the show, sort of scientific concepts like, block transfer computation, which is explained in like 2 sentences, and then we move on and just accept it.
Yeah.
E-space, the CVE, again, explained in a couple of sentences, and then we accept it. But it's all very ingrained and also often very thematic as well. The use of entropy and recursion, these are sort of things which are, they're not, these aren't sort of deep, complex science things, but for a kid, they're just dropped in there, and then that's it. You get one sort of very basic explanation of entropy, and then that becomes the theme for the entire story. So I loved it, and I like how those two things intertwine, story and that's, as you say, the sort of hard science.
Yeah, Bidmead had written for New Scientist before becoming script editor. Although he was already working in television, he was working on a show called Harriet's Back in Town. I don't know what that is, and another one called Rooms. I'm like you. I like it. I don't. We talked about this regularly in the past few weeks. Gareth Kavanagh, who comes on semi-occasionally, has this big love of the previous season and certain episodes, such as the Haunts of Nymon, etc. And but yeah,
it's not an episode; it's a way of living.
Okay. But I'm kind of like you. It's sort of, that new theme tune and new style of Doctor Who very much made an impression on me as a small sort of 4 or 5 year old back in 1981. The other thing, though, as well, is, there is like the sort of the Kavanagh view. I think it's not just Gareth's view. I think there's a wider view of this as well, that it's maybe taken a sort of a particular sort of. It seems almost like these scientific references that you mentioned maybe kind of exclude some viewers. Maybe bring in other viewers. I don't know. But there is also a slight dourness to the season, which is, I mean, it is a season of foreboding anyway, because obviously Tom Baker's leaving the show, and it's a very different sort of performance from him to the previous season. And that some of that is obviously him moving on, etc. But some of it's also in the tone of the material. And then you've got things like State of Decay and Keeper of Traken, which very much feel like sort of medieval costume dramas, where, I mean, I'm sure there's an element of John Nathan Turner sort of leading into, leaning into whatever material, costumes he can find around the movie scene. So, look, we can do these costume dramas, etc. And them, being born from those. But it is a very different series, and there is a very big footprint from Bidmead on it throughout it. Because the science isn't just with the book transfer computations in the e-space. It's everywhere. You've got State of Decay with that whole circle, that evolutionary circle. You've got the thing with the vampires. And of course you've got Logopolis. And then at the same time, you've got this job of getting rid of two characters and bringing in a new villain and introducing a new Doctor at the end of the series. There's quite a lot going on in one run of Doctor Who for one person to sort of bring together stories by lots of different writers and then run a thread through them. And he does that really well.
Yeah, it tonally fits, doesn't it? It's like
a jigsaw. It falls into place by the end of the run.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. And I love it. I mean, there's some stories I don't like as much, that don't work. And funnily enough, the ones I think don't work are the ones that Gareth likes. So Meglos. It's light-hearted and just doesn't totally fit the tone of where Bidmead sort of kind of sits. There's bits of it in there which do, but yeah, I just found it fresh, and I think again, it's to some degree it's a response to Star Wars. Like, how do we play against Star Wars? Eventually Buck Rogers.
His Doctor Who went out opposite, because you mentioned Star Wars, went out opposite the sort of the flashy Buck Rogers on ITV.
Yeah.
Which I think it definitely had an impact, didn't it? I remember my dad. I don't think I saw much of that run of Doctor Who. I definitely don't remember watching more than one episode of Meglos at the time. And when I came back to Meglos and watched it on VHS or on UK Gold, I only remembered one episode. So I'm pretty sure my dad was more interested in, I'm going to say Buck Rogers, but I think we all know what my dad was more interested in on Buck Rogers. And I mean, that was across the board, wasn't it? I think, really. It had...
Yeah, the ratings were good for Buck Rogers.
Yeah. So, but the Leisure Hive is an interesting thing, because you mentioned obviously the science thing, and Bidmead was very closely associated with that. But also, it doesn't give you any kind of... It's not a warm introduction to this new sciencey world of Doctor Who, is it? It goes in hard with the Leisure Hive.
Yeah.
With tachyon recreation generators and...
But the whole thing is hard. You think of the first, that setup shot at the beginning of Leisure Hive, which is that very slow, I think it's a pan, isn't it, that just goes across the beach, Brighton Beach. And it goes for ages before it actually stops on the police box and them in the decks. It's not a usual approach, certainly before, something you could perhaps imagine now, but certainly not done in the 70s. So it has a very different feel, a deliberate, almost like a slowing down of the whole thing from the very first shot, almost as if it's trying to sort of really push away from Williams and sort of say, we're doing things different. We're doing things more mature. I think that's kind of what he was looking for. I think for him to try and emulate Star Wars was like to just look tacky and silly, to do the fantasy sort of run around shooting stuff and big crazy concepts just looks bad on a budget. So let's bring the tone down and make it serious, and thus try and make it look quality.
I mean, that's a fair view to take as well, isn't it? Because in 1980, Star Wars was not Star Wars that we know now, was it? It was, it was very not simply because of like the whole context of the various show, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and cowboy movies and various Japanese things that George Lucas had viewed as well. That they're more present in the consciousness, and they're more related to sort of pulp sci-fi than serious sci-fi. So it's a fair view to take, isn't it?
And I think what's funny about it is that if you look at that era, you can see a bit like we have now with Traitors, where you see virtually every broadcast channel trying to recreate Traitors, the game TV show. Back then, you had shows trying to work out what the Star Wars formula was. What was it that made Star Wars so massively big? And you see film and television trying to replicate it. Buck Rogers is trying to find a way of replicating Star Wars. It doesn't do it. It has limited success in its first season, but it doesn't do it. You look at, as I've said before, I think the slew of fantasy films which came out of the US and UK on the back of Star Wars, because there was an idea that Star Wars was really, sword and sorcery, just with a bit of special effects. And if we take those away, we can do a cheaper version if we do it as a fantasy thing. So you've got things like Dragon Slayer, you've got Hawk the Slayer, you've got Sword and Sorcery, you've got Krull, you've got these films which are trying to work out what this magic formula is, and they can't. And you see that actually going through the 80s is this attempt to understand, the hero's journey and the Obi-Wan / Gandalf / Merlin to the young apprentice who has a journey to, it becomes a thing because they don't know what the formula is. And I think Bidmead is actually quite brave in actually rejecting the formula. And saying, no, I'm not going to do this. I am going to, we're going to do something which, as you said, has a very different tone and try and stand out and not compete because we can't compete. In a way, maybe compete in the sense that I think that season, even though the budget, I don't imagine has changed massively, does actually have a slightly different sense of quality. And I think that's just because it's the way, the tone and the pace of it, not because there's anything there which is particularly better per se. I mean, the special effects weren't particularly better. I think they were a little better than the previous season. But again, I think that's because there wasn't as many. So it was a little, I don't know. It just all feels like tone is trying to set the quality rather than the budget for the first time. And the only time really, because I mean, okay, you see a bit of that still in the Davison era, but not quite in the same way, because as you say, the stories don't carry the same tone, aside from the ones that Bidmead writes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He wrote Logopolis, and he also wrote Castrovalva in the next series, as you mentioned, and then later on Frontios. So, and I mean, I don't want to get bogged into the science thing, but also the other thing is because, I mean, there are people who would be quite critical of this era of Doctor Who because they feel like maybe some of the fun's being drawn out of it or whatever. But there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. So it can't just be purely down to JNT. It can't just be purely down to Christopher H Bidmead. There's a lot of elements and for this tonal shift in the show. But we're obviously talking about Bidmead and his background as a science journalist. As I mentioned, he wrote for Personal Computer World, PC Plus, other computer magazines after Doctor Who, but he's come into Doctor Who at a very particular time. You've got kids who grew up with Doctor Who leaving university or just, early into their time at university as well. And at the same time, you've got a growing computer industry that's kicking off in Cambridge. You've got the BBC special effects unit using sort of British-built equipment, hardware. You've got, I mean, look at when the Doctor's trying to fix a TARDIS in Logopolis. Those graphics are almost pixel for pixel, something that you would later be able to produce within like 18 months on a BBC Micro. These things are all happening, and this industry is building, and it's almost as if kind of in some ways the perfect script editor is in charge because he's able to draw from this kind of possible new frontier of British industry, to go back to a sort of more contemporary term, and found a way to sort of weave it into Doctor Who in some ways. And I think that's quite clever.
Yeah, it's a brilliant analysis. I hadn't really thought of it like that. There is so much like that. It's almost as if he starts to pinpoint perhaps to him where the industry of work, science fiction being a commentary on our times, to him, the commentary had to be around the sciences, where maybe before the commentary was, if there was any, was social. And, Robert Holmes was, more of a social commentary in his stuff than it would be. And that's where that's it. And it feels a bit like the later Cartmel era in the sense that it's trying to weave a little less, it gives less and tries to allude to more, in the same way that sort of Cartmel. I mean, I'm just thinking like we talk about Legopolis. I couldn't imagine in Doctor Who prior to Legopolis a point where you never really find out what the Watcher is. I mean, you have that ADR line at the very end of Sarah Sutton saying, "Oh, it's the Doctor all along," which has obviously been pushed to be added to give some sense of something. But ultimately, it still means nothing, and it never has meant anything. There's, throwaway lines of like, why are we meeting the Master again? He's like, well, in some ways we're the same Time Lord. That explains it all. Everything is kind of considered with more of an adult lens in a weird way of like what matters and what doesn't. And I kind of feel there's a bit of that in Cartmel's period as well. And I think that's great. And I think that's so refreshing. That's why I'm very, very keen on that era, I think, is that it just feels like you can go back to it and there's more to find, while in previous eras and subsequent ones as well, what you saw is kind of what you got. And I just didn't really feel that. I mean, we never really got to explore E-Space. And I know the Big Finish ones have done a little more on E-Space since, but there's just a lot more world building there, which is kind of interesting. And quite a lot of scale in that season too. As you say, you go from Brighton Beach to the Leisure Hive, you go to E-Space, and even in E-Space, you've got, Warrior's Gate is a bizarre one. In itself. State of Decay, as you said, is a bizarre one in the sense that you've got this sort of, vampire horror thing which dropped in, which I think the only thing I would just also say, not to counter you, but to counter the notion, which is quite common, is that it was quite not slow or morose, but compared to, say, Williams, it was a different tone to it. And the Doctor's different tone. But if you go back to Hinchcliffe seasons, the Doctor's character isn't horrendously different to how it is at the end of how it is in Legopolis. And you can almost see in a way what's being shaved back is Baker. Is that Baker's control is being shaved away. And you're getting a Doctor which is a little more like the Hinchcliffe one. Not totally. And I'm thinking more the Jameson sort of space. The Leela sort of space. So that is kind of where Baker is. If, as you say, also invariably there is a little bit of sulkiness to him in his performance, but in terms of the writing, he's still quite a lively character, and very much like the Hinchcliffe eras. But he's just not got that absolute Bakerism which he's got by the time it's Williams, where he's just doing what he wants. And so again, I don't mind that. To me, it almost makes him feel more real. It makes the Doctor feel more of for the first time, almost like quite a sad character in a weird way. A character who's been wandering for a while and has matured. He feels like, and I think that's possibly also what it was trying to do, is to give you a kind of like a character who does feel a little more like he lives in the world. Like as I said in that first opening of Leisure Hive, and he's out there on the beach. It's almost like he sort of exists as a person rather than exists as a character just wandering through space. I don't know. That's kind of interesting. And they're getting the message from the Keeper to go to Traken, and it just feels like, that's the sort of thing you'd imagine again, as I say, in Cartmel's era. But wasn't something really you got before, bar maybe you could argue Key to Time did that with the White Guardian to some degree. But there was just a sort of sense of trying to see the Doctor's world a little differently. And you see that continue out into Davison a bit as well. Because one thing, again, we've got to say with Bidmead is that potentially, probably because he's interested in science, is that the TARDIS becomes a little more of a home rather than just a stopping point, or a piece of the action to some degree, whether it's in Warrior's Gate, Logopolis to some degree, sort of kind of how it kicks off in Keeper of Traken. It's far more present. And obviously in Davison's era, it remains very present, and it becomes a home more than it has ever been before. So that sort of kicked off. And again, I think that's just him trying to make the world feel, and the scripts through him feel more grounded into a person, and sort of living in this space of science, because that's what Doctor Who is, isn't it? And a lot of, whether we like it or not, it is quite a science concept. It's, in the sense that it sits, its pedestal is science fiction, is this whole notion of not just time travel, but of transcendental physics, of regenerations. All these are sort of all very science fiction, but all grounded in sort of the fantasy imaginations around science, rejuvenations, scales, time. And I think, he really bought into that and was like, this is what this show's about. So let's really explore that. And for one season, we got that. I think if we had lots of seasons like that, it'd probably become quite hard to watch, or might have damaged it. But just having one season where you have this approach, I mean, as a kid, I kind of liked it. I don't know. Maybe as a kid, I didn't. I don't remember much of it, but Logopolis it's not really a great one for kids. It's quite complicated. It's quite sad as well. Its tone is sad because, as you say, it's the first one where it's really kind of predicting and acknowledging the show's sense of change. Before that, aside from, I suppose you have what Patrick Troughton saying, with the revelation of the Time Lords, John Pertwee does have a line of saying that his own hubris got him to where he was. But this was the first one which really sort of was like, and I think, to be honest, I think this is Turner more than Bidmead to some degree, is this notion of like, this is a big event. Yes, we're changing the Doctor. Let's make this a big thing. And then Bidmead's allowed to run riot with this and have the Watcher and have this notion of entropy, that things don't remain the same, that everything breaks down. And, it's talking about death essentially. And that's where the Doctor's going and knows he's going. As an adult, looking back and rewatching it, I just find it absolutely fascinating and beautiful as well. I think also we don't say enough about the soundtrack as well. I really like the music through that era. It's, and it carries on through into Davison's as well, but it's just a sort of very, well, I mean, it's also very similar to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy at the time. Yes, very, well, it's the same composer, but it gives to the tone. And, when I think of Logopolis, it's a very wistful music and melody that's playing through that. And as an adult watching it, to me, it just gives me so much. And I think the shows which I like of Doctor Who, have been ones which have a bit of depth and feel like there's a sort of heart to it. And I think this notion that they're very cold and sciencey and not much fun, I would sort of say, they're sciencey, but I would say they're not cold. They're sort of slightly sad and actually quite wistful and beautiful in their own way, with the exception maybe of Megalos. Bless it. But and I think that's why I love it. And I was quite sad to hear that he'd passed, because I think we always hear about Robert Holmes, and I understand that, and Terrance Dicks, I understand that, but and Cartmel, I suppose, in some ways as well, I understand that. But Bidmead to me is really one of the proper rebels who absolutely, which is funny as well, because you've got him and then you've got this extremely entertainment, commercially minded producer who's come on board as well to run the show. And they're almost like there should be a dissonance there, but somehow it works. I liked it. I think it was, and it's a weird swan song, isn't it? If you to the Williams era as well, you think of the Romana K9 Doctor, and it sort of takes that, and you see it slowly, that relationship slowly disintegrate as they all go their separate ways. And then you've got Adric. I mean, it's Adric. Another pedestal of Doctor Who history comes in, and I don't know. It's just an interesting era, isn't it? many characters, lots of different tones, as you said, and they're all really sort of interesting things. They don't all totally work. Full Circle to me doesn't totally work. The evolutionary thing doesn't quite sit right, but it all feels sort of slightly different and unsettling and sad. Yeah. It was good era.
Christopher Bidmead wrote in The Telegraph in 2005, a month after Rose had aired, an article called Doctor Who's Identity Crisis, which he concludes that if a quarter of a century ago the first two laws of Doctor Who were science and story, then the third was keep it special. It might be a super sight gag or a spooky spine tingle, but if it had shades of Benny Hill or The Prisoner, out it went. And that for me is why today's Doctor Who just isn't Doctor Who. But every time my daughter Evie spots this season's debt to something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for her, it just adds to the fun. So what do I know? Which is a good, fair view to take, and I think it underlines the show's ever-changing nature. Just one thing of interest to what we've been talking about there is that I'd been script writing for a commercial TV soap opera and had done some science features for New Scientist. Somebody at the BBC had jumped to the conclusion that this combination might equip me to steer the Doctor in his adventures, and that someone turned out to be Barry Letts. So it was actually Barry Letts who brought him in. Because of course Barry Letts was executive producer for JNT's first season. The influence of earlier seasons, he continues, still hung over us, and much of the work was stripping out these tendencies from the new scripts. Instead of baffle gab that allowed the good Doctor to rescue his party by deftly reversing the positron flow, quotes, we tried to build our stories on solid, if fancifully extended, scientific ideas.
Yeah, and I like that. I think it's funny, when he sort of talks about how Doctor Who was in like 2000s, and it's funny, you think he's right that while Doctor Who in his era was fighting or aligning itself with Star Wars, Doctor Who in the 2000s wasn't really fighting, was kind of aligning itself with Buffy. There was just so much of inspiration in what Russell was doing, which came from Joss Whedon. And that was where the tension was. And yeah, he's right. If you weren't into that world, if you didn't grow up in the world of Buffy, the Vampire Slayer and similar shows, Doctor Who would seem like it was wrong now. In the same way, I imagine people who sort of watched Doctor Who in the 60s might find the sort of influx of science fiction and the Star Wars-isms of the late 70s and early 80s quite difficult, almost like the show had lost its way as well.
It is. I mean, there's obviously a lot of context to these things, isn't there, and how you view, and also the expectations, because with a show that changes as much as Doctor Who, everyone has a sort of like a crystallized view of it, don't they? It might be in case of people who watch it too much, they might have multiple crystallized views of it, like eras or portions of eras, like season 7 or the Hinchcliffe era, etc. And this is probably something that we forget as not so much fans, regular watchers, is that most people don't watch it regularly. And so they come in and out and they see it change, and some of it they enjoy and some of it they don't enjoy so much. Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the Bidmead era, there was a sense of like, how do we make Doctor Who its own thing? And that's what he was trying to do. So when people would turn on, they would see something which he in his mind didn't feel like was a cheap knockoff of Star Wars or just a boring continuation of what the Doctor had done before, but felt like it was something unique that you'd want to tune into. And whether that worked or not, who's to say? But I think that's where his mind was. And I think finally, perhaps one of the last things to say on this would be that it was kind of brave to have a showrunner in that would do that, because one of the problems I'd say with the new series is that all the showrunners are inherently have been Doctor Who fans. Yes.
You've got people who've got a very strong connection to the show and therefore have a very specific vision, which is kind of aligned as to what it is. Get someone in who is a little more divorced from that and sees it from a different perspective. And that's perhaps where you get something like Bidmead, which is, yeah, chalk and cheese maybe for some people. Some people love it, some people don't. But it gives you a slightly different approach to the TV show, which is what I think he provided.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that. He was completely new to the BBC. He hadn't written any previous episodes of Doctor Who or anything like that, unlike other script editors that were brought in already involved with Doctor Who, such as with the BBC and with Doctor Who, such as Douglas Adams. We're just going to conclude this podcast now. Christopher Bidmead was born on the 18th of January 1941. He sadly passed on the 6th of August, aged 84, but the passing was only announced on the 31st of August by Toby Haydock. So that's Christopher Bidmead, who was responsible for a very different Doctor Who series in 1980 through to 1981 Doctor Who Season 18. That's the end from us for this week. We'll be back with more next week. Until then, it's goodbye.